Welcome to AETCM YouTube channel. Today we will have a look at how a long case in emergency medicine YY is taken. Myself, Dr. Shadrish, and my co-examiner is Dr. Arun, and the candidate here is Dr. Suraj. Dr. Suraj, you can start.
So, presenting case of a 67-year-old male. He presented to the ER with a history of cough and breathing difficulty since the last 3 days. So, on initial 10-second assessment, the patient was initially when he was brought to the ER, he was conscious and oriented, and he was able to phonate. On primary examination, on primary survey of this patient, the airway, right now while examining, he has been intubated. The patient currently is intubated and the airway is secured with an AT tube of a size 8. The angle of mouth of the tube is 20. This is the second day on the ventilator. The position of the tube on the ventilator was confirmed by 5-point auscultation, and the air entry is also found to be bilaterally equal. So there has been no displacement, obstruction or pneumothorax or equipment failure associated with the ET tube. To check for his breathing status, the patient's saturation right now is 100%, and he's maintaining the saturation on an FiO2 of 50%. The ventilator is connected on pressure control ventilation with a pressure of 8 millimeters with a PEEP of 5 and a respiratory rate of 19 per minute. He has been given sedation 1 hour back. Assessing the circulation, the heart rate of this patient is 80 per minute, cardiac monitor showing a sinus rhythm, blood pressure is 120/60 and IV lines have been secured. Checking this GRBS last GRBS was found to be 165. His GCS could not be assessed as he has been under sedation, although his pupils are equal and they are reactive to light. On exposure of the patient, there is no any external findings were noted, and currently the patient is afebrile. He's been started on antipyretics since admission. At adjuncts at this point, an ABG was sent. The ABG showed a pH of 7.395. His PCO2 was 48.3. The PO2 was 111, and bicarbonate was 28.9. The ECG done was showing a normal sinus rhythm. There were no STT changes. There's a ventricular ectopic was present. Now, after this, going ahead with the secondary survey of the patient, his short history. So this patient, 67-year-old gentleman, he presented to the ER with a history of cough and breathing difficulty which started 3 days prior. It was sudden in onset and gradually progressive. The cough was associated with mucopurulent expectoration, and there is no history of associated breathing difficulty. There is no history of chest pain that was associated with his symptoms. He also does not give any history of travel, and he has been in his home lately. There is no actually prior history of fever. He had his first febrile episode after visiting the hospital. There are no known drug allergies. He is a known case of COPD, and he's only been started on inhalers for the same. Other than that, the patient denies history of any other medications for the same. His last meal right now since intubation, he's been on Ryle's tube. Ryle's tube feeds have been going on, and no external injuries have been are visible on this patient. On systemic examination, I'd like to proceed with the examination of the respiratory system. So initially on inspection, the chest rise was equal. The trachea appeared to be central in position. There were no visible scars of any previous surgery or injury on this patient. On palpation, because of as he was under sedation, vocal fremitus could not be assessed, although on palpation, chest rise was equal bilaterally. On percussion, the note was resonant. There was no hyperresonance. There was although an area of dullness percuss in the right lower zone corresponding to the base of the right lung. On auscultation, air entry was bilaterally equal, but there were crepitations were heard in the right basal, right mammary and the right infraaxillary area. And other than that, on examination of his cardiovascular system, the jugular venous pressure was initially normal on inspection. There was no visible pulsations. There were no visible apical pulsations. On palpation, apex beat was palpable in the fifth intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line. There was no suggestion of any nothing suggestive of any cardiomegaly. On auscultation, cardiac heart sounds S1 and S2 were heard. There were no murmurs heard. Also, there was no splitting appreciated in this patient. Coming to abdominal examination, again the abdomen on inspection was soft. Did not appear distended. On palpation, it was soft, and percussion did not show evidence of any free fluid in the abdomen. And coming to neurological system assessment, higher mental functions could not be assessed due to his sedation. And because of that, the neurological, even the sensory system, motor, obeying to commands could not be assessed as he was under sedation for the same. His pupils, as assessed earlier, were equal and reactive to light. Then at this particular point with my clinical examination, my working diagnosis at this point would be an infective exacerbation of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and I will also like to keep a pneumonia, right lower zone pneumonia for this patient. So to work up with my diagnosis, I'd like to proceed initially with blood counts, initial complete blood counts to get a status of infection, to rule out an infection with CRP, and along with the blood parameters, I'd also like to get a chest X-ray done. A chest X-ray to be done, and after that we've also done a series of renal function tests. His blood sugars, because of this age, his HbA1c and of blood sugar profile was also sent. After the initial workup, we also got his serum electrolytes were also sent for. So chest X-ray showed presence of heterogeneous opacity occupying most of the right lung from the mid zone onwards downwards, and because of that we actually had to proceed towards a CT of the chest. Before that there was a deterioration in his condition and his saturation was dropping. Because of that he was intubated for the same on the day before yesterday, and he's been on the ventilator since then. After proceeding to ventilation, he was then taken up for bronchoscopy after consultation with the pulmonology department, and the bronchoalveolar lavage was done, which was sent for smears. The smear for the fungal smear had come negative, and the gram staining only showed presence of few gram-negative bacilli with inflammatory cells. He was, after following the lavage, the CT lung showed presence of a cavity in the right lower zone associated with a consolidation of the right lower zone also. Then he was admitted in the intensive care unit for the same. IV antibiotics have been started, and he's been on mechanical ventilation. The blood counts done showed a count of 9,000 with a CRP of 243, which was 89% neutrophilic. So the electrolytes were within normal parameters. His HbA1c was found to be 9.3, suggestive of uncontrolled, probably previously undiagnosed diabetes mellitus, and so he was started with TID glucose monitoring with short-acting insulin, which was tapered as per his glucose readings.
So we'll start with the case, like when the patient came to the ED. So you have done a proper primary assessment and initial 10-second survey also. So is there anything to be done specifically for this patient when he came to the emergency department?
Initially, given that his saturation is to be checked, we again go by the airway breathing circulation protocol. When he had come to the ED, he was talking, which suggested a patent airway for breathing, because if the saturation is low in a COPD patient, we expect a saturation between 88 to 92%. So if the saturation is lower than that is when we need to supplement oxygen, again the target saturation being 88 to 92. The increased oxygen will actually, these people are dependent on the CO2 buildup for their respiratory drive. The respiratory drive is lost when you give increased oxygen to the patients. Increased supplementation of oxygen can cause loss of respiratory drive, which will again actually cause buildup of CO2.
Is it depend upon CO2 or something else?
Hypoxia driven respiratory drive.
Take out the hypoxia and CO2.
So was the patient been on ventilator since arrival to the ED?
No, he was brought to the ER. He was intubated after arrival. After arrival is when he was brought to the ICU and intubated.
So what is the indication for intubation for this patient in the ED?
If his ABG would have shown a
What was the indication for this patient?
he was not. He was intubated in the
Was intubated from outside?
in the ICU.
He was intubated in the ICU.
In the ICU, there was
When
clinic.
taking the patient is
Already.
Fine. What is the ABG finding in the ED?
So initially, the first initial ABG, there was no hypoxia actually. In the first ABG, PO2 was, I don't know the exact, it was PO2 was normal, PCO2 was higher, but that was attributed to his PCO2. And so that is why he was initially just started with oxygen supplementation to maintain oxygen, and serial ABGs were done to progress deterioration, and because there was further deterioration and buildup of CO2, he was intubated.
Can you just elaborate what are the indications for intubation in general?
in any patient. Indications, no, the causes can be central respiratory, locomotor respiratory, causes any persistent hypoxia in a patient, type 1 respiratory failure, initially trial of oxygen or unable to maintain oxygen despite starting a patient on BiPAP. So on failure of BiPAP, which is documented using the Hackor score, respiratory NIV failure, the patient is proceeded for intubation. In cases of cardiac arrest, initially you need not, but following return of spontaneous circulation, you have to intubate the patient and secure a definite airway. In conditions of acute respiratory distress syndrome, wherein the PO2 and FiO2 ratio is less than 100, indicating severe ARDS, can also be done in moderate ARDS. So for ARDS ventilation, that is an indication for mechanical ventilation. Coming to central causes, any injury to the head, the patient coming with a GCS of less than 9, any patient who cannot maintain his airway to prevent aspiration, suggest any obstruction, patient being taken up for bronchoscopy or intubated. Then any patient, so patients coming with hypotensive shock to be taken to the theatre are also intubated. The airway is to be secured because that is again secondary to the drowsiness only.
So suppose this patient is being given a trial of BiPAP in the ICU itself, and probably he's not tolerating BiPAP, so you plan for intubation. So so probably what your clinical intent is, say, okay, let's try something like a delayed sequence intubation. So elaborate on DSI.
Delayed sequence, yeah. Here delayed sequence intubation essentially.
Is it appropriate for this patient to try DSI?
Yeah, in this patient, while the trial of BiPAP is going on, he can actually be, he's not come in a state to us of any cardiac arrest or impending cardiac arrest or active severe hypoxia, where a trial of delayed, especially in the ICU, trial of delayed sequence intubation can be done for him by using the BiPAP along with non-BiPAP. We give him a trial of BiPAP, and the BiPAP is on, then we intubate following this, until the sedation has set in. We go ahead, proceed slowly. The induction agents are then given while he's on the BiPAP, and only once he's completely into the sedation, once the sedation is completely set in, do we switch to oxygenation using a bag mask valve, and then we proceed. After paralysis, do we proceed with the process of
What's the concept of apnea time?
Sorry?
Apnea time. Delayed sequence intubation.
The apnea time is basically the period of the gap between while they are securing the definite airway and the induction where the patient cannot breathe. So a longer period is always going to be more injurious to the neuronal cells. So the apnea time has to be maximum reduced, and the ventilation should be maximally till the point of procedure, the ventilation should be such that the patient is able to maintain his saturations above 94%, so that the period of apnea, he is able to tolerate the apnea also while the scoping and the intubation is going on. The hypoxia does not cause further injury to his.
What is HFNC?
HFNC is high flow nasal cannula. It helps in delivering, normally in an ideal scenario we can only give up to 15 liters of oxygen. However, using a high flow, it is classically used in type 1 respiratory failure. So for them, this comes with a machine and a specialized cannula that is connected, goes to the nostrils, and then that you can digitally, mechanically set the rate of flow of oxygen that you need. And so in case of pulmonary fibrosis, to achieve the saturation, you can deliver high flow oxygen using the cannula.
Also mention about the drugs which are used for the emergency intubation scenarios. The doses.
Sir, we start with pre-medication. First pre-oxygenation is started with oxygen. Pre-medication to be given. Pre-medication essentially comprises first of an antiemetic. That is because these patients are not ideally kept nil per oral to avoid vomiting and aspiration. We choose an antiemetic, and along with that, an anxiolytic can also be given. Anxiolytic and analgesic. Actually, fentanyl, when you use it, also serves as an anxiolytic, but essentially an analgesic is to be given, because induction before giving analgesia is actually a painful process for the patient, but they cannot express it. So, and after analgesia is set in, analgesia and sedation is set in, you go for induction. Induction, the drugs used are either etomidate, preferably at 0.3 milligram per kg, 0.3 mg per kg, and You can otherwise use ketamine. Ketamine is used at 1.5 to 2 mg per kg. It is contraindicated in conditions of raised ICP. It is known to increase ICP. Another drug you can use is propofol. Then the safest drug that can be used over here, etomidate, is said to have minimal impact on the hemodynamic status of the patient. IV fluids are to be started concurrently while giving these drugs. After etomidate, after the patient has been induced, we give a paralytic.
One more reason that probably is very commonly used. Etomidate, you told ketamine, propofol.
Ketofol is also a common.
Any other group? Any role for benzodiazepines?
Benzodiazepines can be given. So then paralytic agents. Again, the safest among all is rocuronium, 0.8 to 1.2 milligram per kg can be used. Succinylcholine always carries the risk of malignant hyperthermia and hyperkalemia. So succinylcholine is to be reversed, although it is ultra short acting. So here we prefer using rocuronium. Other agents like vecuronium can also be used.
So you said something about pre-oxidation. So what is the minimum time for pre-oxidation?
The patient should pre-oxidation should be done for a minimum of 1 to 2 minutes, and till the saturation achieves it should ideally be 100%, but in a patient of COPD we will not be aiming to achieve that much.
So if the patient comes with 100% saturation, would you still do pre-oxidation?
Yeah, the concept is to pre-oxygenate because of, again, like the apnea time that is going to be followed, that can be reduced, because after taking the oxygen off also there will be a period of apnea that the patient will have to tolerate.
What is something called as nitrogen washout?
Nitrogen washout, in the circulating air normally there's 71% nitrogen in the atmospheric air that the patient is breathing. 79. So when you deliver 100% oxygen exclusively via this, it aids in the nitrogen washout, and there will actually be pure 100%. The FiO2 of the oxygen that is going will be 100%. The room air saturation 100% also only shows an FiO2 of 21%.
The main concept is basically when you give 3 minutes of pre-oxidation, so definitely you would take up to like around 5 to 8 minutes for a complete process of intubation. So it prevents further hypoxia till that 8 to 10 minutes. That's why you're giving first 3 minutes of pre-oxidation. Okay, so you have pre-oxygenated, you have positioned, you have prepared your staff, you have given pre-medications. What is next?
So now we proceed with the procedure of intubation. The patient is paralyzed, and once adequate paralysis has been set in, we proceed with the procedure of intubation. Using a direct laryngoscope, we position the patient in the sniffing the morning air position, and once we position, this is obviously after ruling out a C-spine injury, hyperextended neck. With our left hand we enter through the right side of the mouth and we sweep the tongue to the left, and the laryngoscope is lifted aiming at the ceiling ideally in the ceiling in front of the person performing the procedure. The tip of the blade goes into the vallecula before lifting, and the epiglottis and the vocal cords under it are visualized, and appropriate tube size, which has to be arranged prior hand, is passed in with the cuffs. The cuff functioning of the cuff should also be checked before passing in. The tube is secured. There is a black line on the tube. Till that point you pass it into the vocal cords, and then as you take the scope out, you inflate the cuff, and then while ambuing you confirm the position of the tube. You can also use an EtCO2 to confirm a tracheal or an esophageal intubation.
Okay. Is there any technique by which you can actually monitor your endotracheal intubation during the procedure?
Ultrasound can be used. Use of ultrasound on the trachea we have.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so you have done that. You have confirmed your position also. Okay, what is next?
So now we have to connect the patient to the ventilator. This patient will have to be connected to the ventilator, and then a chest X-ray has to be taken to secure the again to just confirm.
Just briefly mention about the common ventilatory settings you will adapt for such a patient.
Here, in cases of COPD, we will actually ideally prefer a volume control ventilation. There is always a risk of barotrauma and emphysematis. Patients can go into pneumothorax, so we will prefer volume control ventilation. The ideal tidal volume also set would be 4 to 6 ml per kg would be the tidal volume targeted in this patient, and again the FiO2 is to be adjusted with the target saturation being 80.
Now you have just intubated the patient, and just tell me the settings in which and the mode in which you are.
Right now, volume control ventilation. assuming him to be he's a 60 kg individual, a 360 ml of tidal volume connected, FiO2 of 100% right now to be set, and a respiratory rate of 20, and a respiratory rate of we'll keep a respiratory rate of 24 in this person. To depending on the ABG that was prior to the intubation, if there was an increased PCO2 buildup was already there, we'd prefer hyperventilation to happen in this patient, so we keep an increased rate. And then after 1 hour we will be doing a repeat ABG.
Almost setting you want to mention?
The inspiratory expiratory ratio. The inspiratory expiratory ratio, again in this patient we'll prefer prolonged expiratory time and a shorter inspiratory time, so around 2.5:1 ratio.
And any more setting? Anything about PEEP?
Yeah, the PEEP has to be, there is no indication for high PEEP ventilation in this patient, so PEEP of 5 can be kept and can be adjusted as per his saturation status.
15 minutes later, the patient is desaturating.
This particular, first we have to again check if the tube has been dislodged, the patency of the tube, tube position should be confirmed. If the tube is found to be in place, there is no obstruction, we should again auscultate for air entry. If the air entry is, you should rule out a pneumothorax in this patient. They are susceptible due to barotraumatic injury. If pneumothorax is there, it will need immediate decompression with that. And otherwise, if all the parameters seem to be normal, we can try with increasing the PEEP a little. We can increase the PEEP by 1 or 2 and then see if the saturation is improving.
Suppose the ABG finding in this patient, as you told, there could be possible type 2 respiratory failure because he's already known case of COPD. So, would you still go with volume control ventilation?
So the main for choosing volume control ventilation was to avoid the risk. If we have ruled out an emphysematic chest, we can actually take up pressure control ventilation and increase let a higher pressure to achieve a higher tidal volume, which will increase your minute volume and help in CO2 washout of the patient.
Okay, so what are the modes by which you can actually wash out PCO2? CO2?
One is by increasing the respiratory rate, otherwise increasing the IE ratio, then increasing the minute volume, that is by product of tidal volume and the respiratory rate. So more the tidal volume is delivered, more the minute ventilation, more the CO2 washout.
How about manipulating the pressure?
Yeah, at higher pressures, you can higher pressure will also help you achieve a higher tidal volume and bring about.
So, will you be able to manipulate the pressure in volume control ventilation?
No, that can only happen in pressure control ventilation.
Right.
What is auto PEEP?
Auto PEEP is the physiological PEEP. So I'm not sure about auto PEEP.
Anything else from ventilation point of view?
So there is something called as extrinsic PEEP and intrinsic PEEP. So extrinsic PEEP is basically, what you're saying is auto PEEP is an intrinsic PEEP. So you can read about intrinsic PEEP later. That's fine. Okay, so you have ventilators now, and you have shifted the patient to ICU also. I mean, in fact, he is in ICU. Okay. What is done next?
Now, the drugs, IV antibiotics have been initiated. Then he will need serial ABG monitorings. The patient has been catheterized. Renal output is to be charted. The input-output charting to rule out any drug-induced, because of his age and a diabetic, a renal function test should be monitored. He will also need a workup for his thyroid profile, serial electrolyte monitorings, because now a Ryle's tube is to be inserted. Feeding will be now using Ryle's tube. So we follow the fast hug BD protocol while in the ICU, so they'll take care of the feeding, analgesia, ulcer prophylaxis, DVT prophylaxis should be started in the patient when you're suspecting prolonged bed rest. At least limb elevation, pneumatic compressions can be given for this patient for the same. Glycemic control should be achieved, thromboprophylaxis. Then patients, if he is passing stools or not, ruling out constipation. If there is a constipation for a prolonged period, rule out an obstruction, and he should be then given laxatives for the same.
So in a sepsis patient, suppose, as you told, this is definitely a respiratory sepsis is there. So what is a minimum or what is a target glycemic control?
140 to 180 milligram per deciliter will be the target glucose.
140 to 180?
42.
It's 120 to 160, somewhere around. Fine. So what do you prefer? Do you prefer OHAs or do you prefer short acting?
So in the ICU we always prefer short acting insulins. It will also give you, it also helps you estimate the response of the patient to that insulin, and it can also be tapered as per his meal, that is the sugar spike. We also know if it's a morning rise, if the rise is happening 3 times, when pre-meal, post-meal, so it can completely be assessed, and after a day it also helps you titrate a fixed dose to the patient so that he can have a stricter control with his glycemic agents.
Okay, so when this patient has a high sugar, say like maybe like around 450s, would you still, I mean, you will continue to do with subcutaneous TID insulin, or you go with infusions?
You know, in this, with sugars, very high sugars will mandate insulin infusion at 0.1 units per kg. We should also evaluate, we should rule out, take a VBG to rule out any acidosis. And if acidosis is present, we should also send for serum ketones are to be sent, and diabetic ketoacidosis or a hyperosmotic hyperosmolar condition should also be ruled out. If it is ruled out, we if those two conditions are there, we hydrate the patient and go ahead with IV insulin infusion should be done.
So how do you taper from IV infusion to subcutaneous?
IV continues on the basis of Delta protocol is how we taper, and once you are shifting, you have to initially give a bolus of the total amount that was given. You calculate the dose, and the 2/3 of it is given as bolus, and then after giving the bolus, then you divide his total dose into 3 doses, which are started following that, which is started for on TID basis with GRBS monitoring.
Would you purchase some sort of probably NPH or anything to
In-
more of glucose control?
Yeah, NPH actually, and being an intermediate acting, you can give 1 dose of NPH, and then as per that with the GRBS monitoring, it will help you reduce the dose of short acting insulin if needed.
So you have admitted, you have done the fast track. What about the antibiotics? Brief me about the antibiotics what are given for this patient.
So for this patient, we would prefer, say initially we'll start with levofloxacin or 3rd generation cephalosporins can be used for this patient.
No, basically, what's your diagnosis? It's a community acquired pneumonia. How are you going broadly
So this,
call it as?
yeah, this will actually be community acquired pneumonia. But presence of a cavity, we should also always have tuberculosis in mind, so for which a sputum workup should be
So if you're
sent.
suspecting tuberculosis, will levofloxacin?
No, we will have to start anti-tubercular treatment or empiric.
Need not, but a patient who is pending diagnosis for a TB, empirically levofloxacin may not be a good choice, right? Yeah.
We can start streptomycin, that comes as a part of
If you
TB.
make a diagnosis of
Okay.
tuberculosis, yes, ATT is the line of treatment, right? So empirically, you are starting somebody on a treatment. What will be the ideal choice in a community acquired?
Extended spectrum beta-lactamase antibiotics.
Same for community acquired?
Uh, we can we can give amoxicillin plus clavulanic acid combination can be given for community.
For macrolides?
Yeah, erythromycin, azithromycin injection, azithromycin 500 mg, IV azithromycin can be started. Carbapenems if
It's
needed.
not for community acquired, no?
Yeah.
If you're suspecting a hospital acquired pneumonia or an immunocompromised patient, then probably you can talk about your beta-lactamase and carbapenems. Okay, continue. So if you're suspecting a cavitatory pneumonia, what are the bugs you're going to think about?
So what are
If you're
the?
suspecting a cavitatory pneumonia, what are the organisms you'll keep in mind?
Yeah, always first tuberculosis should always be ruled out in these patients. Another cavitatory, if there is any serological status of this patient, any we should always keep a pneumocystis infection in our mind. Infections with
A single cavitatory lesion. A patient is alcoholic, let us assume.
Klebsiella is can cause cavity in alcohol.
Gram-positive organisms, you will think.
Staphylococcus aureus causes pockets of air cavities.
Okay, fine. So if you are suspecting a gram-positive organism, what antibiotic will you consider?
We can give them a linezolid. Initially, we can actually start with augmentin, being amoxiclav clavulanic acid. If it needs to be hiked up, we can take linezolid.
What are the drugs which will cover MRSA?
MRSA vancomycin,
Okay.
linezolid,
Mm-hmm.
and
New drug which will start with T.
ticoplanin.
Okay. And if you are suspecting Pseudomonas, Okay, and what will be a good choice of drug?
Piperacillin, tazobactam.
Okay. Is there any role for dual coverage in Pseudomonas?
Gram positive and negative.
In Pseudomonas, any specific role for double coverage?
So clindamycin with
No, there is this concept of double coverage, but in hospital-acquired Pseudomonas, where you can complement your beta-lactamase or carbapenem with an additional aminoglycoside or equinolone, but it's not very sound on a scientific basis. Okay. Now, what is the role of bronchoscopy here?
Given his age, we should also bronchoscopy lavage will help us acquire his. First of all, if we cannot induce sputum in a patient on a ventilator, will help us in getting a bronchoscopic lavage. Another thing being also, it also helps us look for cells and rule out any presence of an bronchogenic carcinoma too in this patient.
No, just think about it. Here we have a patient with a little bit of chronic history, with no definitive history of any immunocompromised state, with something like a necrotizing pneumonia which has been slowly growing. So apart from your diagnostic purpose and what else are you?
Therapeutically.
And probably a diagnostic purpose in terms of an infective organism and malignancy. Is there any other diagnosis probably you might need to think about?
If there's a mucus plug or something somewhere, we can.
Yeah, the right track. Basically, you should also think about any foreign body.
Foreign body.
Okay. Foreign body leading to obstruction and then going into necrotism. Okay. I think we'll conclude it in another 1 or 2 minutes and more fine questions. That's it.
What is the role of monitoring urine output in this patient?
Number one, if he is already a known case of any renal pathology, always monitoring will be needed. The drugs that we use could be nephrotoxic drugs, antibiotics, because any sudden reduction in urine output will mandate adjusting the dose of the drugs as per creatinine clearance of the patient. Like if any use of NSAID, so this will also help us aid in nephrotoxic drugs that are being given. If the hydration of the patient is not enough, he can go into a pre-renal acute kidney injury. As a sequence of sepsis, the patient can go into an acute kidney injury or any acute tubular injury can happen. So all those, the basic initial output charting will help us keep a note of that. Other than that, also the volume status of the patient, if he is in volume overload or a volume depleted status, that can also be monitored by monitoring the amount of fluid that is given and the amount of output that is coming.
Okay. We do always do all the weaning part of the patient in the ICU itself, isn't it? So how do you do the weaning part in this patient?
From the ventilator, for him, initially always the trial after we'll be reducing the requirement of FiO2 if he is tolerating that. He is in synchronizing with the ventilator. We'll have to stop paralysis definitely long back. After that, if he is in synchronization, maintaining saturation with baseline room air FiO2, we can then switch him on to SIMV mode, spontaneous intermittent mechanical ventilation, and if he is able to take breaths, we can also switch on to NIV mode in our ventilator. After following NIV mode, then we gradually, if he is ready, the ABG showing improvement, we can do a trial of extubation. After extubating the patient, you should put him on BiPAP with spacing, and following spacing, if the spacing also intermittently as it increases, his ABG does not show any evidence of CO2 buildup, oxygenation status remains normal, we can switch him on to face mask if need be, and gradually he can, if he is able to maintain his vitals on room air, we can.
What is the relevance of maintaining his neck posture in weaning?
The neck posture can also help in compromise of the airway. Airway compromise, the airways obviously narrowed down.
Suppose the patient is meeting all the parameters which you have told, except he cannot maintain his cervical posture. So what do you mean by that? Would you prefer any other investigation before taking out the 82? The
tone of the muscle tone, the cervical weakness, diaphragmatic, NCV of the diaphragm.
NCV is the investigation. Fine. So that's about weaning. So yes. So we can.
Yeah, I think we can conclude. It was really well presented, and we can go on. Both of us will have lot more questions, and we will have a lot of answers. But anyway, we will conclude here. All of you, I hope all of you got an idea about the way the exam is conducted and the common questions which are asked. And thanks for watching.